Congressman Peter DeFazio.
Roger, thanks. Thanks to Worthy for hosting the event. Thanks for the Peacekeepers for being here. It's great to be in Bend from over the other side of the mountains. Let's start with a question. How many of you went to public school? All right. Well, you know, there are a few kind of inconvenient facts and things they left out of our education. So I'm going to start with a little history. The first slave was imported into the United States 401 years ago this year. 401 years ago. Now, 157 years later, those same colonies had the Declaration of Independence, and it was adopted. It said, beautiful words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Noble aspirations, yet unfulfilled 244 years later for too many people in our nation. And then, you know, we had the Constitution and the Bill of Rights 13 years later. And that's begun what was called the Great American Experiment in Representative Democracy. I got to tell you, our system is at more risk today than ever in our history. The experiment could end if Trump is perpetuated in the White House and his cronies and the most corrupt attorney general in the history of the United States continue to hold office in this country. You heard from a great DA here. You should hear the things that Bob Barr is saying and doing in Washington, D.C. So, you know, we haven't quite delivered on those principles. But, you know, in the Constitution, there were some great things. Article 1, that's separation church and state. They're trying to erode that, of course. Freedom of speech, well, maybe. And then freedom of the press and the right of the people to assemble and petition their government for redress of grievance. Well, we've seen a little problem with that lately too, haven't we? So we're lacking there, but it left out a lot of things. It left out the rights of women, and it perpetuated slavery for 500,000 African Americans in this country because of a compromise between the northern states and the South, who insisted they would not sign and they would not ratify the Constitution unless we continued slavery. And thus were planted the seeds of endemic and enduring racism in this country, and thus were planted the seeds of a violent civil war. And after the Civil War, yeah, we had the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Okay, we had 1868, the 14th Amendment that, you know, all men, quote, men, are equal under the Constitution. And then 1870, the right of all citizens to vote. Of course, that didn't ever happen. Women were not included in that. And because of Jim Crow and all the things they did in the South, it did not happen for African Americans in most of the country. And then finally, we had, you know, there was, you know, incredible violence, the Klan, lynchings, all those things that went on for so many years. We had suffrage 100 years ago for women. That was fabulous. That's great. Unfortunately, it didn't apply for black women in the South and a lot of other people of color around the country. But then finally came the civil rights movement, the modern era, the era, you know, we're at the tail end of, but when I was very young. The civil rights era, you know, Rosa Parks, I met her. I mean, she's about this tall. You know, she wouldn't give up her seat. She wouldn't move. She was really tired coming home from work, 1955. And then, of course, the great heroes, Martin Luther King, and my good friend, John Lewis, who just recently died. And Give it up for John Lewis. Beautiful man. We're going to talk more about John. He was a classmate, a friend, my mentor for 34 years. But I got to tell you, no white man or woman can fully understand the daily indignities, the threats, the terror, or even the murder to which African Americans have been subjected to in our country. The civil rights leaders and present-day activists have been subjected to much of the same threats. John, he came to my district a couple of times, and then I went and I did the Selma pilgrimage with him, which was unbelievable, just incredible, to go down there into the South and really understand what institutionalized racism and segregation was before the Civil Rights Act. Met the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in Birmingham, where they killed the little girls in the church with a bomb. And the Reverend of the church stayed. He sent his family out. They blew up his house. But he lived. He came up in the air on his bed spring and landed in the street alive. He didn't leave. He didn't give up. Nor did John. And then I marched with John over the Pettus Bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, 40th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when John and others quietly, not even blocking the street, on the sidewalk, walking over the bridge, came to the far side and were brutally beaten by the police. John was beaten to the ground. He had a concussion. He still had a crease in his head the rest of his life and a little bit of a speech impediment from that. But John was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi. He never fought back, but he always kept moving forward. Something that we can learn from today. Moving forward, never giving up. And finally, there was cameras there. And just like today with social media, we had a camera for the murder of George Floyd. There were cameras there to document Bloody Sunday. And that caused such outrage, at least in a good part of America, that did lead to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. As John and I were walking over the bridge, we had this incredible moment. We're walking over the bridge, and he's just kind of holding on to my arm loosely, and he said, "Peter," he says, "isn't it incredible?" Because there were police, black and white, men and women, lining the bridge in boats in the water, helicopters overhead. They were worried, even then, about violence. And he said, "Isn't it amazing, Peter?" He said, "They're here to protect us." For a man who was beaten to the ground and, subjected to being jailed and all that. But unfortunately, that isn't true for all Americans, and it's still not true today. George Floyd. Say his name, George Floyd. George Floyd. And then Breonna Taylor. And tonight, I just learned about justice for Elijah McClain. Elijah McClain. Say his name, Elijah McClain. So less than 2 months ago, John died. His life work is not yet done. It was left unfinished. The House passed, repassed, because we already passed it once, but we wanted to make a point, because the Senate doesn't listen, of reestablishing the Voting Rights Act in this country. And we named it the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And then we passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that does away with racial profiling. It does away with carotid and chokeholds. It requires police to wear body cameras. It requires that states, there's states that have no standards for policing. You come in, you apply for a job, you get the badge, they give you a gun, you go out there. It requires states to establish standards. It establishes a registry for bad cops, because right now they can hop from department to department or state to state, and we can't allow that. But that's not all we need to do. That's a beginning, but neither of those things have gone through the United States Senate because of whatever you want to call him, graveyard Mitch McConnell. We won't say his name here tonight. But, so to finish John's work, there are many, many other things to do. And Black Lives Matter is vital to this moment. We need our nation to become the best version of itself, the version that was promised more than 200 years ago to every American. They are attempting to deliver on that vision. And that is, that's just amazing that we haven't yet delivered on the Declaration of Independence after such a long period of time. So these activists, they demand this of us, all of us. Black Lives Matter, end systemic racism, white supremacy, transform policing, ensure accountability in law enforcement, rebuild trust between communities of all colors and the officials charged with serving them. It's, even more than just the criminal justice system. It's about an equitable society, universal access to health care, ensure every American can easily cast a ballot, something that they're trying to stop now, ensure every American gets a working wage. Black Lives Matter activists fight to remind us that the worth of every one of us has, and to remind us that Black Lives Matter just as much as every one else's lives. Not more, not less, just equal as in the Bill of Rights. None of that should be controversial. None of that should be controversial. But some would make it so. They say Black Lives activists are a threat to our social order. I think I've heard that from perhaps President Trump. They focus on a few, not Black Lives Matter activists, but fringe elements, left and right, who perpetuate violence and destruction under cover or against the movement. We must shun them and focus on our objectives. As my friend John Lewis said, a democracy cannot thrive where power remains unchecked and reserved for a select few. Ignoring the cries and the failings to respond to this movement is not an option, for peace cannot exist where justice is not served. In closing, one more quote from John. Freedom is not a state, it is an act. Not some enchanted garden perched high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is the continuous action we must all take in each generation, and there's several, probably 4 generations here tonight. Each generation must do its part to create an even more fair and more just society. That is our duty, our burden, and that's why we're here tonight. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thanks for supporting this wonderful, beautiful event.